The Industrial Revolution wasn't just about steam engines and new factories. Nope, it was a shockwave that completely rewired the entire world. So, what we're going to do here is break down the three major ways societies reacted: how they fought back, how they adapted, or how they were forced to change when the old rules of power and money just got thrown out the window. Okay, so let's just start with a really big question, one that feels just as real today as it did 200 years ago. When a new technology comes along that's so powerful, it completely reshapes how we live, how we work, even how we fight, what happens next? Well, the answer, if you look back at the period between 1750 and 1900, is pretty clear. It sparks a fight, a huge global fight. It becomes this massive battle of ideas, a conflict over what society should even look like, who gets to have power, and what it really means to be a modern nation. So, how did people actually react to this new industrial world? Well, the first response wasn't to tear everything down, it was to try and fix it. The idea was pretty simple, right? You don't have to destroy the whole machine. Maybe you can just fix it while it's still running. And one of the big ideas driving this, kind of the philosophical engine behind it all, was something called utilitarianism. Thinkers like John Stuart Mill really pushed this, and it gave people a powerful moral argument. It basically said, hey, if a policy isn't creating the greatest good for the greatest number of people, then we need to change it. And that became a huge force for reform, especially in places like Great Britain. And you can really see the results of that thinking. All of a sudden, governments started to slowly introduce these major changes. They started expanding voting rights, passing laws to get kids out of dangerous factories and into schools, and even setting up minimum wages. All of these were attempts to, sand down the roughest edges of this new industrial system. But listen, this progress was anything but easy. For the workers, it was a long, hard-fought battle. I mean, think about it. At the beginning of this era, just trying to form a union was illegal. It took shocking reports, like the Sadler Report, which laid out in horrifying detail just how bad things were in the factories, to even start changing people's minds. It wasn't until 1871 that unions and the right to strike were finally made legal in Great Britain. But for a lot of other people, all these reforms were just, putting a band-aid on a fundamentally broken system. They argued that you couldn't just fix the machine. You had to build a completely different one from the ground up. And that brings us to the world as seen through the eyes of Karl Marx. With this one sentence, he offered a completely radical new way of looking at history, not as a story about kings and countries, but as one long, relentless conflict between economic classes. So what you've got here, and this is absolutely crucial, is a major fork in the road. On one side, you have the reformers, trying to make gradual changes from inside the system. And on the other, you have the revolutionaries, who are saying the only way to get real change is to burn the whole system down and start over. At the very heart of Marx's argument was this idea of a great divide. You had the bourgeoisie, that's the factory owners, the people who owned all the stuff, and then you had the proletariat, the working class whose labor actually created all the wealth. Marx believed this setup was just fundamentally unfair, and the only solution was a revolution, where the workers would take control and create a classless society. Okay, so while Europe is totally consumed by this internal fight between reform and revolution, a third, very different reaction was taking shape in other parts of the world. And this one wasn't driven by class struggle. No, this was driven by the urgent external pressure of pure survival. For the great empires of the world, like the Ottomans, China, and Japan, the rise of these industrialized Western powers wasn't just some economic trend. It was an existential threat. They looked over and saw what was happening, and they realized if we don't build our own industrial machine, and fast, we're going to be swallowed whole. And what's so fascinating is you can see these empires all trying to run a similar playbook. You've got the Ottoman Empire abolishing its old-school Janissary Corps, King China launching its self-strengthening movement, and Japan going all in on modernizing its army. These weren't movements bubbling up from the people. This was a frantic, top-down push by the state to try and catch up before it was too late. But here's the kicker. Every single one of these attempts at change, whether it was reform in Britain, revolutionary ideas spreading across Europe, or this race to modernize in the East, ran smack into a brick wall of resistance. In the Ottoman Empire, for instance, the hopes of reformers were absolutely crushed by Sultan Abdulhamid II. He violently put down the Young Turks movement and oversaw brutal massacres, earning him the chilling nickname the Red Sultan. Then you've got China. They had this brief, amazing window of hope called the 100 Days of Reform, but it came to a screeching halt thanks to the powerful Empress Dowager Cixi. She was terrified of losing her grip on power, so she staged a coup, basically imprisoned the young emperor, and rolled back almost all of his modernizing policies. And even in Japan, which, was the big success story of modernization, the path was not smooth. When the government decided to get rid of the samurai class, ending a way of life that had existed for centuries, many of those elite warriors took up their swords one last time, fighting like hell to hold on to their status. And what this all shows us is a truly universal theme. The Sultan was terrified of losing his absolute power. Dowager Cixi was scared of losing her political influence. The samurai feared losing their special privileges. It's a pattern you see again and again throughout history. The people who benefit most from the old system will almost always fight to stop a new one from being born. So the big takeaway here is that these clashes from over a century ago, they're not just old stories in a history book. They were the opening arguments in a global debate that's still going on. A debate about technology, about workers' rights, about inequality, and about the role of the government. It was a debate that defined the 20th century. And it leaves us with one final really important question to think about. Who's winning that debate today?